Hey there team, welcome back to the channel. Welcome to my overview of Great Houses of Calderia. I hope I'm saying that right. So if you're not across it, I do overviews and reviews on the channel pretty much daily. When I do an overview, it's generally a short, punchy video. We keep it under 10 minutes. It's the broad strokes of what you're getting into with the game. Put it on your radar. I only look at the first 2 hours of the game, being that that's the Steam refund window. Steam thinks you can make up your mind if you're going to keep a game or not, and I kind of agree. Broadly speaking, I would say if you're not into a game 2 hours in, you're probably not going to change your mind 20 hours in. So again, it's fairly cursory, and this way I can cover more games and triage what I will and won't review. What do I think of this? Well, it's touted as Crusader Kings 3 but light or indie, and I actually think that's pretty apt. It's definitely got its differences, and you would have to remember to temper your expectations going in, bearing in mind that, well, I suppose there's an argument whether Paradox is AAA or AA as a publisher. I think they're AAA, especially with the amount of money that they ask for and throw around. But getting into Crusader Kings 3 or any Paradox game in earnest is a very expensive undertaking. You'll be paying a premium for the game and then the whole DLC thing. Now, I'm not here to talk about that necessarily, but this is what, $35 Australian, which is, you know, I suppose the high end of indie, the low end of AA, a much more reasonable price point to get into this sort of dynasty kingdom management, kind of 4X, but much less focused on combat and more about, well, like I said, building a dynasty. So that's one thing straight off the bat. The price point is much more accessible, but it is obviously a much smaller bite, very indie. It does some things quite differently and really interestingly. But the other thing is that you got to bear in mind, and this is the more sort of indie you go with a burgeoning sort of genre like a 4X, or even something like an MMO, or something that demands a high level of content as part of the genre, you do really start to stretch the game. And so this does feel a little bit stretched. Examples, not to lead with the negatives, but this is where we're going. Examples being a lot of these sort of event dialogue options that come up, little splash screens of, hey, your character encountered a bloody overturned wagon, or went to watch a play while he was courting someone. Like those two examples in the 2 hours I've spent with it, I've seen half a dozen times at least, right? So already we're running through a lot of that sort of text insert stuff on repeat. And again, the comparisons, unfairly or otherwise, will come to something like Crusader Kings 3. I'm not a Crusader King 2 guy, but 3 I have hoovered. I love that game. That will have repeat text, but because there's so much broad mechanics, there's just more game, there's more stuff going on, it doesn't really hurt you that much when you do have a repeat dialogue thing, because it's only probably coming up every hour on repeat, as opposed to this where it's more like in 15 minutes. So, the loop there is a little bit off, and that's just the limitations. Smaller budget, smaller team. What it does really well is, funnily enough, its scope, its scale is actually scaled back appropriately. So it's not trying to do Earth in a period piece with a billion different factions. You've probably got, about 40 different factions here. And it's almost like if you were to think of it as like a barony simulator, much more at the lower, not peasantry level, but the lower court level that you don't really do in Crusader Kings. And it would be more like an actual sort of geolocative chunk of the world. So, you're not getting into sort of East versus West. It is within the realm of Calderia, and you could almost think of that as one continent out of Crusader Kings. So it is appropriately smaller in the bite that it takes. And yes, you can get into wars and that, and I haven't really touched on that personally because that's not the focus of this game, but it's also something, it is still a 4X. It would take hours and hours to really get into that. But you would have civil inter-regional conflicts, but generally speaking, it's about you controlling your one region. You start off in the barony position, but you can move up through, sort of duchies and all that sort of stuff and have people be your vassals. In fact, the seat of power at the center of the whole game is supreme, and everyone is kind of a vassal to them. So just a little bit more different, a bit more narrow in its focus. The backstory is sort of like this is like cursed lands that was abandoned, and then they decided from the main faction that's outside of this game's scope was like, yep, let's go, let's reclaim the lands, let's send some great families. In fact, when you generate your house at the beginning, you sort of start from the east moving across to the west. So if you're one of the first families that rocks up, you get the more lush flatlands, but the further west you go, the more sort of desolate and deserty it gets. So it has this character, which is really cool. There is no matrilineal or patrilineal, I suppose would be you could say normal if that will upset people, I'm sure. But the normal sort of succession rights of a kingdom passing through the male heir. And it doesn't come across as sort of contrived or posing or anything like that. Rather, it's their own fantasy setting with a fantastical world and a sort of almost frontiersmanship new world component to it. I'm not really against them messing with that. In fact, it does create an interesting dynamic. The game is very heavy on courtship between houses, which is a little bit weaker, to be honest. It sort of brushes up against dating sim at times, but things like jostling for who gets the wedding name rights between the two parties is something that you get into these like little diplomacy mini combat games, which they're novel. I'm not 100% sure if I actually think it's good or bad, so which is probably not a great indicator, actually. If I was smitten with it, you'd know straight away. But yeah, you have these sort of weird, trying to turn the intangible nature of intrigue into a tangible sort of little battlefield, and I guess it's a valiant attempt, but it's very overwhelming and quite confusing. Maybe if you put a dozen hours in it, it'll grow on you, but anyway, but the point I was getting at is you're not necessarily guaranteed to carry the family name if you are using like a male in the courtship process. In fact, if they sit higher above you in the kind of world rankings or however they work it out, the royal rankings, I believe it will default that your family member will go across to them. Now, you become an alliance, which seems quite strong in this game, so losing a family member, or however you want to look at it. I'm not going to dance around political terminology, but if you lose the surname and family member into the marriage, you do get like an alliance, which is a pretty big deal. I have barely touched on the economic component of it, which I really, really like. Again, novel. Novel is the takeaway here. They're doing some unusual, interesting things, and a lot of it works. Some of it doesn't, but even then, it's not catastrophically bad. But the way that you balance your economy is really cool. You essentially have one city at the center, and there's a sort of Civ 6-esque population management. You're trying to manage happiness to grow people, not food. Food is a minimum requirement, but it's more about happiness levels. And you're moving your little pawns around from spot to spot. There are efficiency penalties, so if you do micro it too much, you're going to hurt yourself. I had a huge wine shortage problem, and I was trying to set up trade routes, and you send family members as delegates for trade as well. So it's a different twist on the family member-led dynasty management type game, and I actually really like it for its smaller scale, but it's still 4X. It still has scope, and honestly, I wouldn't mind putting more time into it. Who's it for? That's a really interesting question. Maybe if you're burnt out on 4Xs or Crusader Kings, you'd give this a go, but I would almost argue if you are palate cleansing from that genre, you're not playing a smaller 4X. So I don't know, maybe if you're jaded or over the genre for whatever reason, but even then, this is still something highly inspired by Crusader Kings. And I suppose that's the issue when you have sort of indie games that are aping larger games. It's like, if you're not explicitly doing something really original and new and different, who are you trying to court across from that install base, when most people's entry point would probably be Crusader Kings before it would be something like this? So yeah, look, it's a tricky recommend. I suppose at the end of the day, if you just hoover up every 4X that comes out, you would probably play this, in which case you probably already made up your mind. Anyway, I don't want to go any longer than this. It's cool, it's doing some interesting stuff, and again, like I said, for better definitely, for worse, not so much. Some things kind of miss, but not egregiously. Anyway, check it out yourself. Might just leave it there for the time being. I'll catch you guys on the next one.